Hello everybody, this is Mario Ordonez. We're going to be going over the Axial Skeleton for APU's Bio 235 class. So we'll go ahead and start off with the cranial bones. Right here we have the frontal, right here we have the parietal, and back here we have the occipital, and back over here we have the external occipital protuberance, which is basically used for the trapezius muscle, and right here we have the temporal bone. So for the external view, basically I'm going to be showing you a couple things. The temporal mandibular joint is right up in there. Okay, so now we have the mastoid process, which is right here, and we have the styloid process, which is hidden back here. And the external acoustic meatus is going to be right here, and the squamous part is going to be this suture right here. Okay, the petri is part of the temporal bone on the internal view. Is going to be right over here, and it's basically for the structure of the ear canal. And the internal acoustic meatus, which would be right here, it basically houses the facial nerve, the labyrinth nerve, and the vestibulocochlear nerve, basically all necessary for housing the ear canal. And the sphenoid. Okay, so then for the internal view, we have the greater wing right here, the lesser wing right here, and the the optic canal, which would be down here if it were drilled through. Basically, the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery pass through that. The sella turcica, which is right here, houses, or at the pituitary gland sits right there. The crista galli, which sits right here, and that's basically the falx cerebri attaches anteriorly to the skull right there, and the cubiform plate, which surrounds that. The anterior cranial fossa and the nasal cavity go through those holes. So now we're going to be going over sutures. Be attaching the top of the head back on. We have the coronal plane right here, and being divided by the coronal plane is basically the frontal and the parietal bones. You have the sagittal plane right here, which is dividing the parietal, the frontal, and the occipital bones back here. We have the lambdoid suture, which is kind of like a V-shaped suture, and it's going to be basically dividing the parietal and occipital bone. And the squamous, which is over here, basically joins the parietal and the frontal bones together. Now we're going to be going with facial joints, or facial bones. And get this all together right here. So we have the maxilla, and which is basically the bone atop of the teeth, as well as the alveolar process, which is basically going to be your gum line up here. We have the nasal bone, which is right here, and the zygomatic bone, which is placed right here. And basically the zygomatic arch, which is right here, it connects the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone together. We have the ethmoid, which is basically a big hole in the back of the orbit, and the vomer, which is this bone right here that basically splits your nose in two, and the inferior nasal concha, which is just to either the right or the left of the vomer. And basically what that does, long story short, is it provides humidity for the nasal cavity. Okay, so now we'll be going on to the mandible. The mandible, basically we have the body right here. We have the angle right here. We have the mandibular condyle right here, the mandibular notch, this little U thing, and the coronoid process right here. So now we'll be going on to the vertebral column. So we're going to start off with the cervical vertebrae, which is all these top 7 vertebrae right here, with the exception of the atlas right here, which basically connects the skull to the spine, and it allows for rotation, basically like that. And for the thoracic vertebrae, it's basically the entire midsection of the back, and there are 12 of those. So for the thoracic vertebrae, we have the spinous process, which is on the back side right here. We have the transverse process, which is on the sides. We have the body or centrum, which you can't see from this angle, but it's basically the solid part of the vertebrae that aligns one another. The intervertebral foramen, which basically is just a hole. So if you see right here, you have this little metal hole. That's where basically all your spinal nerves and arteries and veins would go down and go all the way down to the bottom of your spine. And the position of the vertebral discs, which would basically be discs in between the actual spine and vertebrae themselves. Then we'll move on to the lumbar, which would be these 5 right here, and the sacrum, which would be this weird looking bone right here, and there are actually 5 vertebrae that are fused together, and the coccyx, which is right here, and there are 4 of those. Now we'll be moving on to the sternum. So right here you have the manubrium, you have the body right here, you have the xiphoid process right here, and you have the jugular notch right here, which is that little U-shaped thing. Okay, and as we go for ribs, we basically have the first 7 ribs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which are classified as true ribs because they attach to the sternum directly. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 are what you call false ribs. They attach to basically the 7th rib, which attaches to the sternum, but they do not attach to the sternum directly. And then you also have the floating ribs, which do not even attach to the sternum at all, and that's going to be your 11th and 12th ribs. So we're going to go ahead and go over some things. Basically, you have the head of the rib and the neck of the rib, which basically look like the femoral head. And from there, you basically also have the tubercle. And how they articulate with the vertebrae. Basically, think of it like when you take a breath, the rib expands along with the vertebrae, and it kind of interacts that way.